Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for this afternoon on the East Coast and morning everywhere else. My name is Jen Wheeler, and I'm going to put in the chat box right now a link that will help you get some access to some of the materials that we've got for this webinar. So welcome. Our webinar today is about a recent project that Street Law has been doing in partnership with the Library of Congress and the Maryland State Department of Education about bringing Supreme Court case summary materials and sources, mostly primary sources, to middle school students. And if you're a teacher in the state of Maryland, all six of the resources, all six of the cases that we have are cases that are in your standards. And if you're not in the state of Maryland, then you will likely still recognize many of these cases as cases that are in your standards as well. Our goal today is to introduce you to these new materials, to do an interactive session on one of these cases that's kind of particularly relevant to today, and to share some suggestions to support students in examining primary sources, just generally and online. And throughout it all, we hope to make this webinar interactive and engaging. We will ask you to share at some points. We will ask you to ask questions at some points. So we hope that you will participate in those things. If you haven't already accessed the materials for this presentation, there's a link in the chat box if you want to pull that link up and take a look at it. That link will lead you to a form that's just going to ask your name and email address, and from there, once you hit enter, that form is going to send you a response email that's got a link to all of the materials. The reason why we're doing this is because these materials are still being piloted. We're collecting email addresses so that we can reach back out to teachers who are using them to find out, well, how did you use them? Do we need to make any changes to these materials? And so on. So once we get good feedback from folks, we will update the materials and they will be live and free on our store.streetlaw.org website by sometime mid-summer, we're hoping. I'm also going to share the link in the screen in a moment. So I think at this point, if you hopefully had a chance to weigh in on the Tiger King poll, which was our fun poll, and now I'm going to ask Ben to switch us over into our less fun poll, which is, what does teaching look like for you right now? Thank you to those people who weighed in about the Tiger King. Based on this information, will not be watching it. 79% of you said that no, I shouldn't watch it. I didn't really have plans to watch it anyway. So the poll that Ben is going to put up next is about what teaching looks like for you, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, some sort of mix, something else. And that's just going to help us as we go through this to kind of direct some of the conversation to best support you. So this is our agenda for this webinar. We are going to just do a little bit more introductory overview, talk to you a little bit about street law and who the panelists are today. Then we're going to go specifically into talking about one of our cases, the Ex Parte Merriman case, which is a case that's, as far as I know, only in Maryland's state standards, but it's also really relevant to what's happening right now, and it'd be great to make connections to what's happening with government right now. After we go through the Ex Parte Merriman case, which will give you an overview both of the content and also some different strategies that you can use to teach the Merriman case, and any of the cases that are part of this set, we'll then be joined by Jen Reidel from the Library of Congress, who's going to talk about teaching online with primary sources and just generally teaching with primary sources. Then we'll have some time for a Q&A and close out and do next steps. If you have not accessed the materials online yet, I saw that Kathy just added them to the chat, but you can also use that QR code that's right there to access them as well. So I'll hold off on this for just a moment, just in case you want to use the QR code. When you use it with your phone, you'll just pull up the camera and it will send you to a link. And once you fill out the information that's in that linked form, you'll get an email with a link to the materials. So I'll show this again in just a moment. If you want to stay tuned, sorry, not just a moment, toward the end as well. You don't need any of these materials in order to participate in today's webinar, but obviously they're going to be useful after you participate. To participate in today's webinar, there are a bunch of different things that you can do. I see that some people are already getting our chat going. If you want to chat to everyone, and there are going to be some opportunities for you to chat to everyone, then when you go to the chat function, you want to make sure that you use the drop-down tool to share to presenter and all participants. If you're having a technical issue, then just select to presenter. Maybe someone's frozen, which has happened, or you need kind of a repetition. That information will just come to us. And then if you have a kind of a question that you want to get answered, you can use the Q&A function to queue up the questions. We'll have a section where we come back to those questions if we can't answer them right away. And then finally, there are going to be a couple of occasions where if you want to ask or answer a question verbally, you can hit the raise your hand. Make sure you're listening out for those, because I'll let you know when those times are. So here are your presenters for today. On the left, that's me. I work for Street Law. I'm the Director of Teacher Professional Development and Curriculum, also a former middle school teacher. And we're also joined today by Jen Reidel, who is the Library of Congress 2019-2020 Teacher in Residence. And Jen is originally from the state of Washington and is a high school civics teacher. And I've asked Jen to share just a little bit about what she's been doing as the teacher in residence for the Library of Congress over the last year almost.
First of all, I really want to say thanks for inviting me to join you today. And while I'm a first-time caller on this type of webinar, I'm a long-time listener. I love Street Law. So what I do at the Library of Congress is a couple things. I help with their Learning Innovation Department, deliver teacher workshops, and kind of am that teacher voice of what would be useful in a classroom, particularly with a civics and social studies lens. I use my time to research in the collections to try to find items and primary sources that I think teachers could use. And ideally, while I have a secondary lens, I've been trying to think about my elementary folks and how to support them. And then I pretty much just get to dig into things that I find interesting as well. And while the digging's a little different now, sitting in my apartment in Virginia, prior to that, I got some opportunities to look at some amazing notes of Supreme Court justices. So there's a lot that that the job entails, but it's been an amazing opportunity.
We're lucky that Jen has helped us a bit in doing a little bit of additional research on sources to supplement some of the cases that we've prepared. We're going to make sure that we add to Street Law's at-home resources website some of the links to the resources that Jen has found so that you have access to them all as well. But she's also embedded the links here. When we get to them, you'll be able to see them. And we'll thank Jen for the work that she's done. So if you're not familiar with Street Law, this is our mission. We've been around for almost 50 years and kind of newer in the middle school game, but we're excited to be here. We do a lot of different things in helping people teach and learn about civics, the law, government. So that's just kind of a general overview of Street Law. The materials that we have as a part of this project are focused around these 6 cases. So like I said, if you're in the state of Maryland, these 6 cases are in the 8th grade U.S. history standards. But if you're not in the state of Maryland, you'll probably see some cases that are relevant to your interests. Some of these are in the top cases nationwide as far as standards go. Each of these cases, we have kind of a pack of materials that goes with them. So we have a case summary that's written on between an 8 and 9.5 grade reading level, includes a little bit more background knowledge about government and history compared to some of the high school case summaries, includes a glossary. We've got, and this is shorter than our high school case summaries. Each of the case packs has 3 sources, many of which are from the Library of Congress, and those sources are related to that case in some way. Each of the case packs has an essential question that can tie all of the materials together, and some suggested resources. The resources may be well used as teachers building background knowledge. There could be some lessons in those resources, or there could be some student-facing resources in there. So you'll want to take a look at those resources before you decide exactly how you want to use them. All of these materials are also in Microsoft Word files so that you can manipulate them. And right now, one of the things that we're doing as we collect feedback from teachers is we're trying to figure out how teachers are using these materials so that we can eventually create kind of a teacher's guide or list of suggestions for how they might, how they've been using these materials. So we hope that you'll contribute to that when we come around to ask. So from here, we're going to get into talking about one particular case, the Ex Parte Merriman case, and how you could teach the Ex Parte Merriman case if you're working in kind of a synchronous environment. But I'll also offer suggestions throughout about other ways that you might be that might be good for teaching this particular case. So this is just kind of an overview of what these materials look like. And you'll see that we've got, this is not quite everything, but you'll see this is kind of a set of the resources. And I'm going to be highlighting some of these resources as we go, but this is what the Word documents would look like when you download them. So we're going to start, we're just going to kind of jump right in to part of our interactive part of the lesson. This is the essential question, or I should say this is the claim that goes with the essential question for the Ex Parte Merriman case, which deals with rights during wartime. So what I'd like for you to do is think about this question, this claim, and then this is kind of emulating our take a stand strategy that we typically do with teachers during professional developments, where you have kind of a continuous scale and you ask for students to place themselves on that scale. We obviously can't do this in person, but you can do this in the chat box. Is if you want to think about where you would stand on this question about, or on this claim about whether the government should be able to limit people's rights during wartime. And if you strongly disagree with that, you'd put a 0. If you're somewhere in the middle, you'd put somewhere in the middle of 1, 2, 3, depending on how strongly you feel. And if you strongly agree, you'd put a 10. So make sure that you selected all panelists and attendees so that other attendees can see how you're answering in the 2 drop-down space in the chat. And then type in your number for how you feel. Thank you, Rachel, for putting in how you feel about that. Scott, Monica, thank you. And if you want to add in kind of some reasoning for why you've placed yourself in that way, I'll let people continue to write down their responses and pay attention in the chat area. But one of the reasons why we selected this case was because we could pretty easily right now substitute out the term wartime for national emergency and have a really relevant conversation, a really in the moment conversation happening. And so I think that that's just something to think about is when the government should be able to limit people's rights and our reasoning for whether, if we say yes, if we say no. I'm seeing a lot of people who are more on the disagree side of things. It's quite interesting. I did this with a group of teachers in one of the districts in Maryland about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago now. And there were definitely more of a range. So I'm wondering if how we're living in the moment is impacting some people's thoughts here. So thanks, Mary. That's an interesting response. In the past, maybe a 6, today a 0. So if you're using this question, and you're having students do it interactively, you want to have some questions prepared to kind of push their thinking and help them follow up on things. So I wanted to share a couple of the questions that we have that help push students' thinking. So does it matter if the war is on home soil? Would that change your response? Does it matter if the war is a civil war, meaning that Americans are on either side of the war? Should the government maybe be less likely to limit people's rights if it's Americans on either side of the war? Which rights do you think are more sacred and you'd hold more strongly onto as the government perhaps is starting to take away rights in the interest of safety? Which rights are less sacred? Which rights are you more willing to give up? I would imagine at this time some of us are more willing to give up the right to move about freely. What other factors might we take into consideration when weighing this question? So for example, what if the government limits the rights of just certain groups of people? That offers us some connections, for example, to the Korematsu case. So this is the essential question, and this is the way we like to start this ex parte Merriman case, because it offers students a better understanding of kind of the context, the time. The ex parte Merriman case takes place during the Civil War, and also kind of extrapolate some of those big ideas of we have rights. Sometimes our government makes decisions to limit rights at different times, and so to be able to be thinking about that as we go into looking at the case. Here's just a picture of a PD that we did where teachers got to talk a little bit about this. You can see that if you do this in person, hopefully in the fall, that you can kind of have students stand along the continuum and be interactive. So before we talk more about this case, one of the important terms in this case is habeas corpus. And if you're working with middle schoolers, it's probably a good idea to review this important term prior to students reading more about the case. So the term habeas corpus is Latin for to have the body. And what that essentially means is that it's a rule that requires someone who's under arrest to be brought into the court so that the government can provide reasons that they were arrested lawfully. So basically in this case, John Merryman gets detained and he petitions for a writ of habeas corpus to argue that his detention is not valid. So in a moment, we're gonna read the background of how that came to be and kind of find out what happened, whether it was the government rightfully taking away his rights or not. Before we get there, though, I wanted to just share all of our case summaries are written in the same format. And so we're going to chunk out and read some of the case summary as we go through this webinar. So all of our case summaries have background and facts, a constitutional question, arguments for either side of the case, the decision, and the impact. And one of the things that we've been telling teachers is that because these are in Word, you can manipulate the documents to create different activities out of this. So you'll see on the PowerPoint that I've sort of manipulated the arguments so that you don't know which side the arguments are going to be for. And you could do that in the Word document as well. It's pretty, not very time consuming to have to do something like that. So this is the background and facts of the Merryman case. I'm going to stop talking for a moment so that you can read what happened with Merryman. And as you're reading, think about that essential question. Should the government be able to limit people's rights during wartime? And think about whether this case is kind of changing that initial response that you had at all. Give about 30 more seconds to read this. All right, so like I said, I've chunked out the case summary into these different sections on your screen. So the next part of the case summary is the question. One of the things that these case summaries do, particularly for middle schoolers, is they allow for students to learn more than just the flashcard approach to a case. That they ask students to dig in deeply to the Constitution, to the arguments that are made using the Constitution, and kind of the context of that case. So the constitutional question for this case is, does the president have the power to suspend habeas corpus or delegate that power to the Army? And next, we're going to look at the arguments made on either side of the case. But before we do that, I just want to point out one issue, just in case you were wondering. This case is called an ex parte case and only has one name, unlike a lot of Supreme Court cases. Basically what that means is the case was decided without all parties present, and that's pretty typical in cases that involve habeas corpus, writs of habeas corpus. If you want to know more about the ex parte definition, we have more information in the glossary that you can kind of look at after we do this. So next, we've got some arguments that go with this case. And what I've done is I've just pulled these arguments and copied and pasted them. One of these arguments supports President Lincoln, the Army. One of these arguments supports John Merryman's side. So remember that President Lincoln and the Army are trying to argue that, yeah, they have the power to suspend habeas corpus, that they need this right. And Merryman is saying, no, I want to get out of jail. President Lincoln does not have this right. So in the chat box, take a look again, and you'll, one thing that I can ask you to do is in the chat box where it says to all panelists and attendees, tell me, does the red argument support Lincoln or Merryman? Yeah, all right, good job. So we've got a few people that are pretty quick on it. Red supports Merryman, that the Army, the President Lincoln don't have that power. The Constitution gives that power to suspend habeas corpus to Congress. And in fact, I don't have a sticker for you, Kristen, sorry, but you did a great job. In fact, one of our sources that goes with this, this set is the actual excerpt from the Constitution that talks about Congress's power to suspend habeas corpus. So that's an opportunity for your students to dig into the Constitution itself as one of the sources, and just a very small excerpt of the Constitution, so it's not overwhelming to them. So then obviously the blue argument is in support of President Lincoln, that it's lawful and he is able to delegate it. Though if I had to compare these two and say which argument was stronger, I might say that red's stronger because it's got the power of the Constitution behind it. But that's certainly a question to ask students, is which arguments are stronger and why. And if you're teaching in an asynchronous way, you can mix up the arguments on the Word document and send it out to them, ask them to arrange them for either side, and then also follow up with talking about which arguments are stronger and why. So I've got another one, but we're going to skip through it because you get the gist, which side is the green argument for, which side is the orange argument for. Here are all the arguments together. And so this is just one way of kind of viewing the arguments. All the arguments together will be what it initially looks like on the case summaries that you download. And again, this is an opportunity where you could ask students which arguments are stronger on either side and why do you think they're stronger on either side. Synchronous could be a discussion that you have as a group, or if you're working asynchronous, you can have students write their responses out to that. And here's an example. When we did this in our professional development with teachers, we actually cut up the arguments so that they could manipulate them and kind of move them around. Hopefully that's something that you can do when school is back in the fall. So here's the end of that case, the decision and the impact, if you want to take a quick moment to read through. Got an interesting decision and impact, maybe not expected. So as you can see, Chief Justice Taney, who may or may not have been acting on behalf of the Supreme Court, there's kind of an interesting, I'll let you do your own research if you want to look that up, an interesting kind of role that he had, ruled that Lincoln did not have that power, that only Congress had that power. And this is one of those cases where Lincoln said, I don't care what he ruled, that I'm going to continue to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. I'm going to continue to suspend habeas corpus because this is in the interest of the country. So from here, one of the things that you can do is ask your students to think about, because we started with the essential question, now that we've learned more about the Merryman case, does this change their opinion about whether the government should be able to limit people's rights during wartime? Why or why not? And to cite some information from the case in order to answer that question. So this doesn't change my opinion because in Merryman, blah, 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 blah. So that's kind of one option for follow-up. Then once you've reviewed the case, we do have 3 sources that are paired with this case. I mentioned that one of our sources was the actual suspension clause from the Constitution. You can see that image in number 1. Another one of our sources, number 3, is actually an excerpt from an article from a Baltimore newspaper about the Merryman case, especially interesting because it's Baltimore centered, so there's certainly a bias there in the response. We're going to look a little bit more at, and not too long because we're kind of running out of time for this section, but a little bit more at source number 2. So this is source number 2, and in the case pack, this would be on a page with several questions. I'm going to share the questions here on the next slide, but that's the source information that's also on this page. We don't expect you to be able to read the kind of blurry part at the bottom of the image. We've tried to replicate some of that important information in the source information in the blue box. Take a moment to read that source information. And so from this source, as students are examining this source, there's several questions that we have on the page to help them examine and think more deeply about the source. Here are those questions. And we've kind of scaffolded them so that there's some kind of more basic questions toward the beginning, but eventually it leads to claim development that links back to that essential question about the government limiting people's rights during wartime. So in an asynchronous environment, you could have students in breakout rooms discussing this or lead them through a group discussion altogether. Asynchronous environment, you could ask students to jot some of their answers to some of these questions. What that eventually leads us to in that claim development is having students think through these kind of two starters, that this source supports the government limiting people's rights during wartime. And one of the reasons that they could give for this particular source is that it shows people in Baltimore were violent and dangerous, especially to the Union Army, which you can see in the background. And so the president needed to suspend habeas corpus to protect the troops and the nation. On the other hand, this source could be used to say that it does not support the government limiting people's rights in wartime. And for that particular sentence starter, it's a little bit more focused on the some of the information from the source information section. The source is biased. It's created by someone who likely did not observe this incident, but that created something, the engraving, after it happened. And the creator of this engraving was from a Union stronghold. And so he might kind of have some bias toward the Union and toward supporting Lincoln's decision. So we wanted to try to create sources that could go in multiple, allow students to go in multiple directions with the essential question. And this is just an example of teachers taking a look at the source. If you're back in your classrooms in the fall, one of the things that we did with teachers is we gave them all different sources, and they, in groups, first kind of jigsawed it out. They looked at the source all together, if they shared the same source, and kind of thought through the questions together. And then eventually they got up and found someone with a different source and shared the other sources and talked a little bit more about what they found. So you could then eventually wrap it all up with coming back to the essential question, having students incorporate what they've learned about the case, what they've learned about from the sources, to come back to this this continuum again. So now we're gonna get to some kind of reflecting on these materials and debriefing on these materials, and also some Q&A soon, but not quite yet. If you have any Q&A questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and if we can answer them immediately, we'll type out answers. If we can't, we'll hold them off until that Q&A section that's coming up. But now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to talk a bit more about teaching online with primary sources.
So before I start, I just really want to thank everybody for joining us on this webinar. And when I'm not in DC, Jen mentioned I'm a classroom teacher, but I want to mention that everything that we're showing you can be used for all types of students. I think sometimes court cases we think are just for the higher level students, but I currently teach an alternative school where sometimes school isn't that easy for my folks, and I use these prolifically. So I'm real excited to show you some additional sources. I think there was a question in the Q&A box about how do I find more sources that will help students. I think the idea was get a general sentiment or a broad view. So I want to show you some. You should be looking at right now a document, and I'm going to kind of go through this a little quicker than I think we all would with our students. But this is a manuscript. If you're looking at it, you might prompt students, what do you notice about this? So you might expect students to say things like, I notice that there's something, maybe words like major general, a commander. You might notice there's a secretary of state. You might notice that there's some phrases in there. It looks like I can see midway through, writ of habeas corpus. If you're able to see, and I promise I'll blow some of this up in just a second, you might notice the phrase command, and you might notice that you have power at your discretion. So as we're leading students through, and the Library of Congress, where I'm currently working this year, we actually have primary source guides that are tailored with questions that you can use to prompt for students depending on the type of source. So if it's a manuscript, you might use different questions to get kids to really be digging deeper. So when we go a little bit deeper into the source, which is my next slide, we'll see that this pertains to, and if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great.
Right.
There we go. I hear, okay. So you'll see there, if you look on the left, I have taken a portion of the manuscript you were looking at, and it says, and I'm going to read it to you because I don't know what type of screens you're all on. You are hereby authorized and empowered to suspend the writ of habeas corpus within the limits of the military division under your command and to exercise martial law as you find it necessary in your discretion to serve the public safety and the authority of the United States. Now, you might remember I focused on the part of this, that who was this to? And this was to Major General Henry Halleck, but we don't really know till the back side of the document who is it from, and that's that on that right side there. What information does page 2 reveal? And at the Library of Congress, we have 2 pages of this document that are scanned that you'll all be able to access. You'll notice it says Lincoln A, so this is from Abraham Lincoln. It's December 2nd in 1861. So question to you is, if you were able to catch the date of the Ex Parte Merriman case, that's a spring month. If you look at the date there on the right, what does this information of comparing the dates of the case and the decision of Justice Taney, what does this tell us about Abraham Lincoln, his actions that are spoken about in this manuscript? So just write any of your observations in the chat box. In looking at this, what does this manuscript tell us about Abraham Lincoln and the writ of habeas corpus? And I'm going to be quiet so you can collect your thoughts and hopefully write it to all of us so all the attendees can see your brilliance. So I see that I think Ginger told us that Lincoln rejected the Supreme Court decision and proceeded to continue the practice. Amen. I couldn't say it any better. And Lincoln was ignoring the ruling. And that in itself, what a powerful conversation to have with students about what does it mean when the Supreme Court issues a ruling? How powerful is that ruling? Is it only as powerful as it's enforced by the executive? This also provides a little different narrative that many of your students might not have about Lincoln, in that a lot of people think of him and herald him as one of the top 5. I think historians consistently rate him as one of the top 5 presidents. When we talk about this, here's a president that suspended a civil liberty. How does that sit with our narrative of him? So this particular manuscript that you'll find at the Library of Congress is part of Abraham Lincoln's papers. And he has multiple papers where he actually talks about and references writ of habeas corpus. And so I like that Darren said he's bypassing the rule of SCOTUS and why he was hated by so many at the time. There's just so many interesting rabbit holes we could discuss on this. So what I'd like to do next is just reaffirm the power of using court cases and primary sources. So the first thing that I really want to push to all of you, this is on the next slide, is that court cases are so much more than just the legal ruling. They represent that convergence of social, political, and economic forces. And so when we think of this, can we go to the next slide if we're able? There we go. In that first point that I'm making there, I think a lot of you probably know it, but the power of court cases in my experience over many decades is that students love stories. They love narratives. And I know for a fact when I've taught a constitutional principle or something about an ideal without a court case, I do not have the same deep learning as I do when students have been given some type of narrative about real people that the law has affected. And so, like, for example, when we think about Brown v. Board, well, it definitely is the culmination of the work of so many people fighting for civil rights. It also is set against the backdrop of the Cold War and the urgencies that existed then with foreign policy. So when students start to understand court cases are the product of a lot of forces converging at once, I think it becomes really powerful. And that's where I think that what Jen and her team has done in getting primary sources together can really help your students understand the power of what they're learning in these court cases. So I took some time and went through the Library of Congress resources to find a few more primary sources that you might use that's in the court case pack that Jen highlighted at the beginning of this session. Many of you know Plessy versus Ferguson. and challenging separate but equal, or challenging that law and then establishing that as our precedent until Brown v. Board. This is a image some of you might recognize, is from, I took it from the primary source sets that you can see there in your chat box, the link. The Library of Congress has done some of the work for you and curated primary sources that you're able to use free of any type of copyright restriction. This here is a political cartoon taken from the Puck magazine that was prolific in its political cartoons that it put out, commenting on societal topics in court cases. And I'm going to check the question. I can talk too much. So that's a great question. Are some of the resources that the Library of Congress have, it looks like the question is, are they transcribed? So great question. On the resource I highlighted on the last page, which was Lincoln's manuscript, the letter to Major General Halleck, that does have a transcript, some are not. As a side note, we actually have an initiative at the library called, it's a crowdsourcing initiative called By the People. And there, you and your students, we recommend 12 years and up, can go and help us transcribed. So I would really recommend everything that's transcribed is because people have done the work in doing so. And right now the crowdsourcing has various initiatives. So if you're interested in different times in history, we have different campaigns. But unfortunately, not everything has a transcription. So you're right, with students, the cursive can be problematic. What I'd recommend is don't use the whole document like I showed you initially. Blow up a section, enlarge it, and have them grapple with it. We had a group of kids come to the Library of Congress and look at Rosa Parks documents, and we did that. We gave them the whole document so they knew we were having fidelity for the source, but we also enlarged the section we thought was most relevant. So that is a great question, but please play around on the Library of Congress site and I can give you some tips on that. So this might be a cartoon you use with Plessy. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that out of, we have a database called Chronicling America, which is newspapers from 1789 to 1963. And there are also topical sets already put together for you that you can find this from. And this is from the Richmond Planet in 1900, which would be 4 years after the Plessy decision. And this is written by an African-American man who's a pastor and talking about the injustice through poem form of separate but equal. Moving forward to the next case that I want to highlight, and I am a Northwest girl, so if I say this wrong, I've been told you say it Worcester versus Georgia, so somebody in the chat box can tell me if I've offended you. In this case, on the Cherokee being able to keep their lands. Some of you that know this know that the Supreme Court did rule in favor of the Cherokee, yet Andrew Jackson and subsequent administrations refused to follow that. This is a gem of a map I found that was commissioned by the state of Georgia, and it basically shows the viewer, and I'll show you in an enlarged text in just a second. It tells the viewer how much gold is estimated to be on the Cherokee land, and it really emphasizes states' rights in getting to determine what's going to happen with this sovereign nation. So if we go to the next slide, you will see I've enlarged the map where it said that portion of it, and this is what I transcribed, a map of that part of Georgia occupied by the Cherokee Indians, taken from an actual survey made during the present year, 1831, in pursuit of an act of the General Assembly of the state. This interesting tract of country contains 4,366,454 acres of many rich gold mines, and you can see that it continues to describe the land as rich and beneficial. And it would be really great to use with students in conjunction with the court case summary that Jen's put together along with her primary sources of using this map. How would this type of a map, what would it reveal to us about the sentiment of many people living in Georgia? What did they think about native sovereignty? How does sovereignty and the supremacy clause and treaty rights fit into this? So that would be excellent as well. And then I wanted to end at this because I think Jen and I and the team wanted to make sure we had a lot of Q&A time. But I really encourage you, play around with these court case summaries that Street Law's put together, and as well as think about how can you help students recognize that court cases are much more than just the legal principle. They represent people and they represent moments in time that are part of our story. And these primary sources can help enrich the telling of that story. So I'm going to mute myself and let Jen take it over and see if we want to do some Q&A or anything else.
Thanks, Jen. Before we get to the Q&A, I think one of the things that I wanted to do, this is something that we usually do in our PD sessions, and we did it at one of our recent, in the last webinar that I did, it worked really well, is to ask you to think about these materials and how you might use these materials with your students. So I just talked specifically about the Merryman case, but before that, I showed you that we have 6 cases. We have Marbury, McCulloch, Worcester v. Georgia, Ex Parte Merriman, Dred Scott, and the Plessy case. And we've got the case summary. We've got sources that go with it. We've got an essential question for all of them. So where do you think these materials might fit into your instruction? It could be that you're thinking about right now, and so you're thinking, oh, I know how I'll use this case summary for next week's online instruction. Or you could be thinking about how you might use those materials maybe next school year when it fits into your in-person teaching. But if you would go into the chat box and make sure that you're selecting all panelists and attendees, and then jot out some of your ideas about how you might use some of these materials with your students. We'd love to hear kind of what cases you're teaching, the ways that you might be teaching these cases, how you're depicting these cases as stories, like Jen said. And if anyone wants to verbally respond to this question about how you might use these materials, you can click raise hand and we can get some of that. Yeah, so Jennifer sent this to just the panelists, so you might not be able to see it, but being able to actually print out the material so that students can hold them in their hands, the sources in particular, and kind of look more closely at them. And I think it's Nora mentioned using these materials with the Constitution unit. Get students thinking more critically, not just about how the Constitution was created, but then how it's used after it's created, how it's interpreted after it's created. Any other thoughts about how you might use these materials? Enter them into the chat box. And now let's make some space for the question and answer time. So this question and answer time allows us to just more broadly open up kind of the lines of communication to any questions that you might have that are relevant to this webinar, on the materials that we've created, on the work that Jen's doing at the Library of Congress. During this time, the best way to communicate your questions is either through the Q&A option or by raising your hand in order to ask a question verbally. The chat box sometimes gets a little overloaded and we might miss questions there. So if you can either use the Q&A or the raise hand function to ask a question, we'll leave a couple minutes for you if you're thinking about a question now. I'm going to highlight Latanya in the chat suggested having students create comic strips kind of explaining the events of the case. And if you wanted to do that digitally, there's, I guess it's an app or an online tool called Storyboard that it's like.
Jen, I had an idea too. If some of, I don't know if how many people have access to Flipgrid, That might be a tech tool, and I know not everybody's districts have that or can use it. But if you do, and if you're familiar with it, you could video yourself giving tips of how to go through the case. And then the kids, you could do one of the analysis or the activities that Jen highlighted, and the kids can film themselves giving their maybe a quick 2-minute presentation of how they would argue different sides of the cases that you're choosing to focus on. Again, that assumes you have this as a tech option, but it is, you could use that as well.
Mary had a question. Thanks, Jen. Mary had a question earlier. Do you always, never, or sometimes relate Supreme Court cases to what's happening today? And I think that that's a really interesting question to think about. Wanted to throw that question out to you all to either type out your responses in the chat box, or if anyone wants to raise their hand to answer that question. Do you always, never, or sometimes apply some of these Supreme Court cases to today? Obviously, we applied the Merryman case to kind of what's happening today, not as in depth as you might do with more time with your students and thinking about rights during emergencies and how that's similar. Getting some responses to that question now. Thanks, Darren, Rachel, Kevin. Yeah, it makes it relevant. Sometimes students have trouble connecting Merryman during the Civil War, who cares, to what's happening today, but it helps them see the connections. Yeah, and I think Timothy brings up a point. It's just something to think about. You know, you might want to answer that question for yourself before you throw it out to students, just to be predictive of where the conversation might go, and you might need to kind of set some norms because it's going to be a more challenging conversation. So certainly to ask the question, but also to think about what the question about connecting the case to today, but also to think about what the responses might be.
Hey, Jen.
Yeah.
I think I saw somebody use the word, or you did, talking about having students wrestle with precedents. I think you could do that, whether that be asynchronous or synchronous, and having them think about, if they look at a variety of cases, which street law has a whole bunch that they could look at in terms of presidential power in a time of crisis, and maybe that they have to then pick from those cases which precedent ought to apply in this moment in time, particularly as things are unfolding with current events today. And I think you could do that in a lot of ways, whether you're tech heavy or tech minimal. But it's a powerful conversation that somebody pointed out that kids should and could have. Yeah,
and that brings up, that's one of the strategies that we tell high school teachers in particular to use, is thinking about what cases serve as precedents. Do these cases serve as precedents for anything related to today? I want to highlight, Bridget mentioned in the chat, having students think about who stands to win or lose in a given situation. One of the strategies that we suggest for using the case summary is there's a section at the very end that says impact. Well, if you took off the impact and asked students to write their own impact statement, that would let them think a little bit about, all right, now that I know the decision, what could the impact of this be? Who would win? Who would lose? And kind of down the line, what might that mean for the way that government works with or against people? So one option would be to kind of have students write their own impact statement, and then they could compare it to the one that we wrote and see how they compare. So let's, we're going to move on to toward the very end, and I'll share with you the materials once again at the end and how you can access them, and all our email addresses as well. We want to thank you guys for joining us. Here's the jot form link and the QR code that will take you to that link if you don't want to frantically try to write this down. We're also recording this so you can rewatch it and write these things down or use the QR code again. This will take you to a form where you'll just write in your name, your email address, and the email that will come back to you once you hit enter will share with you all of these materials. You can expect for me to reach back out to you at some point, maybe within a month or so, and ask you if you've used these materials and what you think about them, if you change anything about them, how you use them, so that we can update these materials. Like I said, they're in pilot mode right now, and we want to just get them better by getting teachers' feedback on them. Street law has lots of different resources outside of what we've talked about today. We've got hundreds of case summaries, current cases, recent cases, historic cases. We've got any AP government teachers, or if you know an AP government teacher, we've got the 15 required cases. We've got a bunch of different lessons on government civics and the law. We've got some instructional videos, some mock trials, and something that we call deliberations, which are readings about current controversial issues that present both sides without any bias, hopefully. So we've got lots of materials available for you. We also have created a page for how you can use street law materials for at-home learning. The link is at the very bottom. We are updating this page frequently, so make sure that you check back every so often. A lot of the suggestions that we offered today are on that page. And you can get links to the resources that I shared today also on that page. If you ever use the Street Law Store, which is usually a free store, I just want to highlight that you will likely not have to pay for any of the materials, but it may not be very clear about that until the very end. So just make sure that you go to the very end and you'll see that payment is not required, and it will let you download the materials immediately once you hit place order. If you're not following us on social media, here's how you can do it. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. It'll keep you up to date on all of the materials that we're creating and upcoming webinars and so on. And then if you're not following our educator newsletter, this is on our streetlaw.org website. Just scroll all the way down and you can use that teal bar to hit sign up for the newsletter. Our webinars, we have 2 webinars that are coming up, one for AP government teachers this Thursday, thinking about what the new exam will look like and how you can use street law resources to help students prepare for that. And we have a student webinar. If your students want to learn more about what clerks of the Supreme Court do, they can attend that webinar with a former clerk to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Amy Bergquist, who will answer their questions. And we have registration for these 2 webinars is available on our at-home learning page. These are our email addresses. That's me at the top, Jen Reidel, right there in the middle. We are looking out for your emails. We are taking your requests. We look forward to helping you in the future. And thank you guys, and thank you, Jen, for joining us today.
Thank you. I know it was a fire hose of information, but contact me if you need any help on how to use the amazing things of street law, as well as how to implement primary sources with those resources.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.